Hey guys, I was actually planning to upload this video for the last 4 months, but unfortunately I didn't manage to finish it. Therefore, I even have more examples. Here's my review of the Sony 16mm 1.8G with a brief comparison to the Sony 14mm 1.8G Master. As of September 25, the Sony 16mm retails about 980 euros in Germany and the Sony 14mm 1.8G Master around 1300 euros. You will find out why I ultimately sold my 14mm in this video, so make sure to watch until the end. You can use the Sony 16mm on your full frame camera as well as on APS-C cameras. With the APS-C camera, you have to remember the crop factor, which ultimately gives you an equivalent focal length of 24mm. It weighs 304 grams. There's an aperture ring including a click switch as well as a switch for the autofocus manual focus. And for the front element you need a 67mm filter. The 14mm on the other hand weighs 460 grams, also has an aperture ring and a switch for the autofocus manual focus, but you don't have a filter thread. The 14mm has the smallest aperture of f16 and the 16mm of f22. Over the years, Sony has given the 16mm 11 aperture blades and the 14mm has to make it with 9. The close focusing distance of the 16mm is also significantly shorter at 15 centimeters than the 25 centimeters with the 14mm. I only bought the 14mm at the time, so I could record in 4K 50 with my A7 IV with a crop factor so that I could get a 21mm because I absolutely needed the wide angle. One of the biggest disadvantages for me was the lack of a filter thread for the ND filters to film myself in daylight with a blurred background. Thanks to the 67mm filter thread on the 16mm, I can finally use ND filters without any problems. You can find my recommendation in the video description. The vignetting on both lenses is significantly at open aperture, but noticeably more pronounced on the 16mm. The more you stop down, the better the result. Otherwise, use the correction in Adobe Lightroom. Chromatic aberrations are a bit more pronounced on the 14mm than on the 16mm in my opinion. The 14mm is of course a bit older. However, when shooting with both lenses, you will find a greenish and magenta colored shimmer here and there. It is always important with the autofocus that you tell the camera what be in focus. That is a vehicle, person, animal or car for example, or insect. The autofocus works much better on cameras with AI chip, such as the Sony 6700, the A7C II or for example the A1 Mark II. I found the 16mm to be much more precise. Despite the same focus area, the focus was much faster in video mode than with the 14mm. When I walked in front of the camera, I could not notice any difference. If you take photos of landscapes with one of these two lenses, you will not be able to notice any difference. Then I was in Cologne for you, down on the Rhine island, to test flaring. The 14mm has an integrated lens hood, which is not removable. The plastic lens hood of the 16mm unfortunately broke recently when I bumped into something, but I can replace it much more easily than with the 14mm. I couldn't spot a big difference between those two lenses, but feel free to see for yourself and write me your opinion in a comment under this video. Where I really like to have both lenses with me is for street photography. You get an extremely large field of view, sharp photos and if necessary a blurred background. Of course, the 14mm is a bit heavier in the long run and unfortunately has to be used without ND filters. This can be super annoying in long run if you have to work with fixed shutter speeds and ISO when filming. When it comes to pure photography, you have a 2mm difference that I really haven't seen. You should definitely have a wide-angle lens with you on your travels, whether for landscapes, interiors, or the night sky for example, or if you'd like to photograph yourself with a background. I would say that the 14mm is a bit better in terms of quality than the 16mm, although the right mix of aperture, ISO and shutter speed also ensures the right sharpness and performance here. The perfect companions for your travel, even if I personally prefer the 16mm. Not only because it's cheaper and newer, but also because it's much more compact than the 14mm. I have used both lenses very often at events in the club. In low light you will see the true strengths of these prime lenses. The cameras find the focus much faster thanks to the 1.8 aperture. I have already noticed a very big difference between 1.8 and 2.8. Not the classic prime lenses for portraits, but there's always an interesting perspective. Especially for group shots at weddings or spectacular close-up shots, they are definitely recommended. I will show you now how these two lenses perform for vlogging. So here again is the 14mm. Of course you get 2mm more, so a bit of more wide angle on this lens, but on the other side it's super front heavy if you plan to use it on a gimbal for instance. And compared to the 16mm, it's heavy. After a while you feel that straight away. And something I do recommend also when you purchase the 16mm, because if you want to travel, you want to keep it as light as possible so you can pack other stuff in your camera backpack, maybe a telephoto lens or something. And especially if you want to film yourself, I think the 16mm is the lens to go with, because on the 14mm you can stop down only to f16, while on this one it goes down to f22, and I can use an ND filter like this one here on this Sony a7C Mark II, which is from Nissi 67mm. And the good thing about this filter is it's a vario filter, so here's one stop and that's 5 stops I can use on this filter. So I'm filming myself here with a 2.8 aperture. The sun is shining into my face, ISO 800 since I'm filming myself here in S-Log. For filming interiors, architecture and landscapes you have two really good lenses here. What distinguishes the two lenses from each other are the 2mm focal lengths, the weight, and of course that you can use an ND filter on the 16mm. That was ultimately the reason for me to sell my 14mm, even though the performance in terms of distortion and vignetting was much better with the 14mm. But since I record with a fixed shutter speed and ISO, I need an ND filter. I neither want to have a gigantic filter construction, nor do I want to spend too much money on it. That's why I choose the 16mm. With a DJI Ronin, you also have the advantage that the center of gravity of the 16mm does not shift as far forward as with the 14mm. Both lenses create a really nice blur background, with the essential feature that the bokeh balls are a little rounder with the 11 aperture blades with the 16mm. Then we come to my very subjective conclusion. First of all, the 14mm. Much more robust construction, the lens hood is fixed, the front element cannot be easily protected with a filter. For my taste, the distortion is a little less. There has to be a difference between a G and a G master lens. However, there are about 4 years between these two lenses. If you only care about photography, for example, astro, events, interiors or landscapes, and absolutely need a shorter focal length, then I would take the 14mm. But now I film more than I photograph, I absolutely need an ND filter, and I use the lens on a DJI Ronin from time to time, then the 16mm is clearly the better choice for me. In addition, it is more compact, lighter and folds less forward due to the lower weight. On the other hand, the vignetting in photo mode is much more present without correction than with the 14mm, but I have the 16mm with me at events. It doesn't stand out and I get unique perspectives. If you'd like this video, you can buy both lenses via the link provided in the video description, as well as the filter, my power bank, which I use to charge all my devices such as cameras, drones, MacBook, and of course my memory card. Thank you very much for your undivided attention. See you next time here around on the Daniel Life.